Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 107 for the 6th of Adar base in a leap year. I've entitled today's episode, The Smuggler, which is an analogy I cannot take credit for. I actually stole it. Speaking of smuggling, haha, from a very special man named Meir Abasera. Some of you may be familiar with him, familiar with his work. He was a very interesting person. He started out as being very well known in the world of macrobiotics. He was a healer. He was a speaker, a writer, a lot of different things. And eventually he came to Chabad Lubavitch and became a chassid of the Rebbe. He actually became known as the Rebbe's whistler. Yes, you heard that right. Like he whistled. So the full story behind that is a little bit too tangential to get into now. Maybe I'll talk about it more another time. But basically, one time at a Farbrengen, at a Hasidic gathering in 770 with tons and tons of people, the Rebbe motioned to him and told him to whistle. And so Meir Abasera started to whistle with his two fingers, and he made a really loud sound, and the Rebbe encouraged him to continue. And thereon, he became known as the Whistler, the Rebbe's Whistler. You can see videos of this. It's actually really quite fascinating. But to get back to the topic at hand, so Meir Abasera passed away a few years ago, actually, but one thing that he left behind is a book that he wrote, which is one of my most favorite books. I highly recommend it to everybody who likes especially very poetic writing. It's called The Possible Man, Life in the Shadow of the Just. And it is sort of like this very poetic autobiography that Meir Abasera put together around the topics of Chassidus and just using really beautiful imagery and language and everything to explain topics in Chassidus and talk about his life sort of in an autobiographical sense in a really unique way. Even the title, The Possible Man, is an allusion to the Tanya. It's an allusion to the main character of the Tanya, the Benoni that we've been learning about, otherwise known as the intermediate man. So it was sort of like Meir Abasera was saying that this Benoni is somebody that we can all possibly be. It's possible for us to do this. And Chassidus kind of gives us the tools to do that. So in the book, there is a chapter 2, called The Smuggler. And I'd actually like to just read from the book, straight from the book for you, as I think that the way that Meir Abasera explains this idea of a smuggler is really too beautiful to gloss over. And I'd love for you guys to hear it in his own words. So here we go. This is from page 33, chapter 2 of The Possible Man by Meir Abasera. So Meir Abasera writes, "My faults outnumber me. I have become so small by comparison that without all this fright, I would surely look like a mite on the track. But I consider my faults a blessing, as they assist me in diverting the attention of those who wish to do me harm. Because in truth, this train carries a priceless cargo. I have brought my faults along only to serve as a decoy, to help me make it past the frontier. Had I officially stripped myself of all my defects, it would have been impossible for me to make the slightest move. My faults serve as a camouflage. By assuming the colors of the landscape, I am able to fool the custom guards. They search my baggage but find nothing, for I have disguised my cargo as bags of stones. The guards, crisp and efficient, swagger and wink among themselves, concealing their scorn for this unkempt, unfashionable immigrant. Let the Jew take his last trip, they say, but the irony is mine. They think they are sending me off to die. In fact, I have never been so alive. With an absurd and automatic, much obliged, I move on." So that's the end of the excerpt from that book. And so you might be wondering to yourself, what does all that mean? Who is the smuggler? What is he smuggling? Where is he smuggling it to and from? Who are the guards? Why does he have to smuggle these things? So hopefully we're going to answer all of these questions in today's episode, which I think very much relates to today's Tanya. So in order to understand this, I think it would be useful to recap some of the things that we've learned so far. So what have we learned so far? Well, we learned about how every Jew has two souls. We have an animal soul and we have a godly soul. We learned about how our primary identification, our sense of self, our ego, our personality, all of those things is really our animal soul. That's when we think of the I, the self, all of those things. We also learned about how the godly soul, by contrast, is a gift from God. It's a part of God himself. And we learned about how these two souls have very opposing desires and wants, and how they are engaged in a perpetual battle inside of our bodies in order to gain full dominion over our bodies. And we talks about how for the Beinoni, or for those of us who are striving to be Beinonim, this war is perpetual and never ending, and the godly soul will never gain full dominion over our animal souls. And we talked about how and why this should not make us feel really depressed and despondent, because we should realize that, first of all, struggling is our purpose and there's value in the struggle itself, and that we can get a lot stronger and gain a lot through struggling and all of that. And then more recently, we've been talking about this idea that we can also and should really focus our attention towards the godly soul and not focus so much on our animal soul, and recognize the fact that we can actually nourish our godly soul that hovers above us and feed the flames of the godly soul through our good deeds and through our different actions. So that brings us to where we are now. And in order to, again, understand this whole idea of the smuggling and what we're smuggling and all of that stuff, there are a few things that we need to understand about both of these souls. So as of now, it probably sounds like the animal soul is getting a pretty bad rap and the godly soul is getting really amazing acclaims and everything like that. But we'll see in this chapter that it gets a little bit more complex, and that there are some limitations, believe it or not, to the godly soul, and how the animal soul is not just something that is like this annoying thing that we need to overcome and obstacle that we need to work around, but it actually serves a very, very essential purpose. So let's start off by talking about the godly soul and talking about some of its limitations. So the best way that we can really understand the godly soul is by looking at people who really embody the godly soul, who are not like the Beinoni or are not like me and you, but are actually people who have succeeded in winning this war, have succeeded in having their godly soul conquer and rule over the animal soul. So otherwise known as tzaddikim. So these are men and women who are very righteous and who, as we've talked about, have succeeded in really totally squashing the power of their animal soul, and the godly soul has full dominion. So this sounds like a really amazing thing, right? Like, what could be higher than that? This is what we all would love to be, these kind of people. So what we'll learn about in the chapter today is, yes, we don't want to take away from the holiness of these people, obviously, but what is it that makes these people so amazing and kind of defines them as being tzaddikim and really allows their godly soul to shine, is this incredible sense of love and fear that they have for God, right? So it's like, we talked about this, how it's like their entire motivation, their entire yearning, everything is just about God, God, God all the time. And there is no sense of their own needs or anything. So that sounds great. However, and it might sound like the Ultra Rep is being really nitpicky here, but we'll see that he's really not, and it's something really to keep in mind, is that as much as a person can love God, no matter who they are, no matter what we're talking about, no matter what level they're at, the very fact that it is a person who is loving God or a person who feels awe of God, this itself makes this love and awe limited, because it is limited to the person's own intellect or mind or emotions or whatever it is. So if you think about for yourself personally, anytime you might have felt a sense of love or awe or fear of God, think about maybe the last time you had a really good day and everything seemed to be going really, really well for you. So maybe you felt this like tremendous love and gratitude towards God. So that's a great feeling, right? But it was limited to your experiences and was limited to your understanding of what God is and what God's capable of. So too, let's say if you went to see the great wonders of the world or Mount Everest or something like that, you might have been overcome with this tremendous sense of awe. Some people say it's like they feel like they really see the unity of the universe and they feel like they're one with the universe and all that stuff. So that's really great feeling to feel. But once again, it's really just your experience of that, which by virtue of it being your experience is going to be a very limited thing. So now the issue with this is that when we're talking about God and we're talking about who God is, God, as we've talked about, is not only just the creator of the world and the ruler of the world and all of those things, he's actually the one exclusive reality. So when we say that there's one God and not two, and we're going to talk about this a lot more when we get further into the Tanya, but there's an exclusivity there. There's a sense that the only true reality is God. There's not me and God and you and God and all those things. There's only God. God is the only true reality. So if we want to really connect with God in a real way, any kind of feeling that we have that is our own personal feelings towards God is kind of incomplete in a certain sense. And it's not really going to allow us to connect with God in the utmost way, in a true unified way of truly being submerged and connected with him. The only way to connect with God fully, the only way to really be unified with him in a truly manifest way is through true nullification. So it's kind of like the idea of like, you can't pour tea into a full cup kind of thing. So it's like if a person has a sense of self, no matter who they are, no matter how holy they are, so far as they are self-aware that they have a self-definition, by virtue of that sense of self, there's no room for God to manifest his sense of self. So this is the first issue that comes up when it comes to the godly soul. So going back to, I know there's going to be a longer episode, so try to stick with it. There's going to be a lot of components to it. Hopefully everything will come together. But the godly soul, as great as it is, one of the limitations of it is in the fact that it has a sense of self. And so going back to the smuggler analogy, and this is where we can start to bring it in, one of the objectives that we need to figure out as Jews that we're here is one of our purposes in life is, or perhaps our sole purpose in life, is really to bring God down here into this world. So how do we do that if we're saying that God cannot dwell in a place that is not totally nullified and that is not totally selfless? So how does that happen? So one hint at this is in what we learned about previously when it comes to the mitzvahs, when it comes to the different laws that God gave us. So again, I think there's like sort of like this misconception that when we talk about Jewish law, when we talk about halacha and things like that, it's like kind of like just this like rule book to keep us religious or something in some kind of nice way. And it's kind of like a traditional thing to keep us like Jewish or whatever. But the Tanya takes it a lot deeper. And the Tanya explains to us how on a very profound, deep level, the halachas, the laws of the Torah, are actually the manifest will and wisdom of God. And so this is one of the, and it might not feel so comprehensible because it's not really like a logical thing necessarily, but it is a true fact that when it comes to God's will and wisdom, those are unified with him. Those are direct manifestations of who he is, and God, in a miraculous kind of way, being who God is and God being able to do whatever he's able to do, he was able to constrict his will and wisdom into these laws, so that when we perform these laws, when we do the will of God and we do the things that God told us to do, we are actually tapping into the essence of who he is via his will and wisdom. So we talked about this previously. This is similar to if you are really thirsty and you ask your spouse or your good friend to go get you a glass of water. If they go and get you that glass of water, well, it might seem like a very mundane act from the outside if somebody just sees somebody going to the kitchen pouring some water, but there's actually a very deep connection going on, that they are fulfilling a very deep will of you. So now another thing that we have to bring up here is another limitation of the godly soul. What is the limitation of the godly soul in terms of the purpose being to bring godliness and the godly soul and its manifestation down here into the world? Well, the godly soul is entirely spiritual. It's 100% spiritual. It has absolutely nothing physical about it. It has no dimensions. It has no materiality. It doesn't take up any space. It's really, really not physical at all. And then when you look at, the physical world, and specifically our physical bodies, which is where we're supposed to try to manifest our godly soul into, our bodies are entirely physical. We've talked about previously how our bodies really ultimately is just like a hunk of flesh, really, and bones. That's really what our bodies are. So how are we supposed to connect these two opposites? Something which is so spiritual, namely the godly soul, and the physical body. And so this is where the smuggling comes in. And this is where hopefully we're going to bring all of this together and understand this. And eventually we will get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all this. So what it is that we're trying to smuggle is godliness. Where are we trying to smuggle it into? We're trying to smuggle it into the physical body. Why do we need to smuggle it specifically? Because again, there's no connection. The physical body is not interested in anything spiritual. The spiritual reality of our godly soul is not interested in anything physical. They have nothing to do with each other. So how do we bridge that gap? Who's going to smuggle these two things? So if you remember, as we've been talking about, we have another soul. We don't just have the godly soul. We have the animal soul. And this is where it can really shine. So the animal soul, as we'll see, is this famous smuggler. The animal soul is the very entity that allows to serve as this intermediary between the godly soul, which is entirely spiritual, and the body, which is entirely physical, because the animal soul is somewhere in between. The animal soul is a soul, like the godly soul, so it is a spiritual thing. On the other hand, it has very much a connection to the body and to physicality, and its drives are not for godliness, are not for holy things like that. The will of and the yearning of the animal soul is for physicality, is for eating, for drinking, for sleeping, for going to the bathroom, for engaging in all kinds of physical pleasures. That's what the animal soul enjoys. That's what the animal soul likes to do. But again, if you remember what we've learned in the past in the Tanya with the analogy of the prostitute and the Zohar, deep down, the animal soul actually also wants to serve God. It also wants to do God's will. And so just like going back to the story of Meir Abasera, how he might appear to the guards as just some like random guy, like some bummy guy who's just bringing rocks over the border or something like that. So that it's meant to look like that. We're meant to have our animal souls appear like that, as these like foolish souls that just want to be very hedonistic and live for pleasure all day long and that kind of thing. But deep down, the will of the animal soul is actually aligned with the godly soul. And this is where it makes it for a very interesting thing, is that if we can just get that animal soul to tap into its ultimate purpose and to its ultimate will, it can actually serve as an incredible smuggler to smuggle the godly soul into the body. And so the way that this works is once again bringing it full circle back to those mitzvahs, back to the commandments, to Jewish law, to halacha. Why? Because again, first of all, we talked about how halacha is the direct will of God, right? And it's the direct wisdom of God. So it is not limited by love and fear and that kind of thing, but it's actually has a much more direct connection with God in an unfiltered way. And interestingly enough, and this is how we see it, that it all connects. How do we do God's will? How do we do halacha and those kind of things? It's specifically with the physical body. It's not with the godly soul. It's not just spiritual things. So, lighting Shabbos candles, putting on tefillin, eating kosher, all of these things are physical actions that we need to do. So when we go back and we think about the animal soul, again, what is the function of the animal soul in daily life? Like what does it do exactly? We can think of, how do we define really the animal soul? We can think of it as like the life force of the body. So if you just took a body without any kind of soul in it at all, no godly soul, no animal soul, it really would be a corpse, God forbid. That's what happens when somebody passes away and we say their soul leaves their body. We don't just mean the godly soul, we mean the animal soul as well. There is no soul left. So once you take away all the souls from the bodies, it doesn't move. It doesn't do anything. So the purpose of the animal soul and what the animal soul does inside the body is that is the life force that allows us to move, that allows us to eat, that allows us to drink, that allows us to talk and think and do all of these things. And so when we utilize this power of movement, this power of action that we have within our animal soul to do the will of God, this is the way that we smuggle godliness into this world, because we're doing physical things. So the body's like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this. This is physicality. This is my realm. This is what I do all the time. I'm eating, I'm talking, I'm doing these things. Meanwhile, they're not just eating and talking. They're eating kosher food. They're saying a bracha over the food. They're doing these holy things, these very, very godly things, but it's clothed in a very physical way. And this is how godliness actually gets smuggled into the world. So it's a really deep idea. It's a very cool idea. And I think that Meir Abasara was brilliant with coming up with this analogy of the smuggler. So once again, so to break it down, is that basically what's happening is that you have the godly soul, and God's ultimate purpose, God's ultimate wish, is to have the godly soul be manifest here in the physical body. However, there are a couple of problems with that. One is the fact that the godly soul is extremely spiritual and the body is highly physical. And the second problem with that is that the godly soul, as great as it is limited in the sense that it's all about feeling God in its spiritual sense of love and fear and all those things that are very particular to the particular soul. And so the way that we circumvent these two things is by bringing in the animal soul, because the animal soul, first of all, serves as this intermediary which connects the two. And it does this through Jewish law, because Jewish law is not limited the way that fear and love of God is limited, because Jewish law is a direct manifestation of God's will. And Jewish law also is something that can only be performed by the physical body down here through the animal soul. So that's the way that God gets smuggled into the world. So I hope I explained this well. I really tried to break it down as best possible. We're going to get into the text now and see how the Alter Rebbe breaks it down and goes through it. And then maybe we'll try to give a little recap at the end. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins this section by bringing to light an analogy, which he had already brought up, about how we likened the Shechina, the divine indwelling, to the light of a candle. So the Alter Rebbe says that here, to explain further and elaborate upon the mashal, this analogy, where we talked about how the light of the Shechina is like the light of a candle, where just like the light of a candle does not shine and does not hold on to the wick without oil, so too does the Shechina not rest on the body of a person who is likened to a wick. So the body of a person our bodies are likened to wicks. But the only way that the Shechina is able to rest upon the body of a person is through good deeds. And it's not enough just to have their soul, even the godly soul, which is a part of God himself. This godly soul does not serve as the oil. So a person might think that, their godly soul is the oil by which the Shechina is able to rest on the body. And the Alter Rebbe is saying, no, it's not. You need to have good deeds. And the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that this is actually obvious and clear to any intelligent person. Why? So now he's going to elaborate upon that. So he says that even if a person is a total tzaddik, so what is a total tzaddik? As we have defined already, this is somebody who serves God with fear and love in a way of ta'anugim. So it's a very, very high, it's a love of pleasure. So this is like a very high level of love, the highest form of love that we talked about. And even still, so even such a person, think of the holiest person that you can think of, somebody who's truly serving God out of total fear and love all the time, they are not nullified in their source completely. To be completely nullified in the light of God, to become totally unified in total unity. Even such a tzaddik remains a person. They remain an individual because they are this person. They are, by definition, the fact that we're saying that they love and fear God, that means that they are a person who loves and fears God. So they are separate from God. So this shows that there is something lacking in terms of this like unity and nullification to God. Like you can't be a self and totally nullified at the same time, basically. And so then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says, which is not the case. When we talk about mitzvahs and good deeds, these mitzvahs and good deeds are God's will. And God's will is the source of all life for all of the worlds. and all of the creations that came down into this world through different symptomim, constrictions, and different concealments of the will of God. So again, we talked about this a little bit previously, of this whole idea how all the creatures in the worlds, everything, the life force, everything, it all comes from God's will. Sure, it comes down through these different permutations and concealments and constrictions and stuff like that, but ultimately everything in this world ultimately comes from the will of God. And it had to go down through all these levels in order for these things to be created in a way of something from nothing, and that these things have an existence in their own right, so that they will not be totally consumed and nullified in their existence. So everything in creation basically is like a concealment of God, ultimately. However, the source of these things, the source of these creation, the source of the vitality of the entire universe is from the will of God. And now when we go back to what are the mitzvahs are the inner will of God. So the mitzvahs are the will of God. And there is no concealments like this. So the mitzvahs are in this separate category. They're not the same thing as other types of creations. They don't have the same concealment. And their life force is not something different from who it is, but it's actually, and the fact that this is the case, this makes them actually totally unified and subsumed in his will, and they are like one with him completely. So we're starting to understand that basically the Alter Rebbe is pointing out the difference between loving and fearing God. Even if somebody is a tzaddik and a really righteous person, this love and fear of God is still limited in the sense that there's a person who loves and fears God, versus when it comes to the mitzvahs and good deeds, these are an actual expression of God. So they're not concealed in the same way that other creations are, and they're actually the source of all of creation. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that the whole idea of the indwelling of the Shechina is the revelation of God and the infinite light in something. Meaning to say that this thing, like when we say that the Shechina is dwelling, is within something, it means that this thing that it's dwelling within becomes totally subsumed in the light of God and becomes totally nullified completely. It's called batul b'motzius in Hebrew. So like totally nullified in its source completely. And the fact that it is nullified in this way, this allows the Shechina to be able to dwell and allow for the oneness of God to be revealed within this thing that's dwelling within it. However, anything which is not totally nullified to God, like that is not nullified in its source completely, then the light of God cannot totally be revealed within it. So even if you have a tzaddik who's a total tzaddik who completely attaches themselves with total love to God, at the end of the day, as we've learned, there's no type of thought that actually can grasp God in a true way. Because the truth of God is that there's just one, him alone. He's totally unified, totally one, and there's nothing except for him, and everything else is nothing in comparison to God. So thus, when we say that there's somebody who loves God, this is a something. He's not a nothing. So it means he's not really tapping into the true reality. So again, the true reality is that there's God and then nothing. There's nothing else. So if there's a person who's loving God, this means there's a person. So he's not tapping into this ultimate truth of nothingness, because again, there's no type of actual thought that can grasp God completely. So no matter how profound or deep a person is, how connected they are and whatever, they will never be able to totally grasp God. And so because they will never totally be able to grasp God in this full way, and because they still have this sense of self, this light of God cannot totally rest upon them and to be revealed in them without, so now here's the caveat, and here's how they can get around this, is through keeping mitzvahs. So without keeping mitzvahs, the divine indwelling cannot dwell upon them. So this means that when we keep mitzvahs, why? Because what are keeping mitzvahs? Keeping mitzvahs is the will and wisdom of God, actually, without any concealment at all. So once again, so just to recap where we're at so far, we're saying that there is God and that ultimately there is nothing but God. But at the same time, God desired to create a world. So he created a world, and through creating the world, in order for there to be a world that exists apart from him, he had to constrict his light into many different constrictions and concealments and all kinds of things like that. And so Then when you have a person who's connecting to God in a very real and deep way, so you have a tzaddik, somebody who really works on themselves and has this ability to love and fear God in a true, very, very true way, as holy and spiritual as they may be, they're not really allowing God to fully rest within them because they are still a person, and they're not, and they still have a sense of self-awareness. And so this sense of self-awareness that comes about by virtue, almost paradoxically, of the fact that it's displayed in the fact that they love God, they fear God. So they are a person who loves and fears God. This limits the flow of godliness into them. So how do we overcome this? Is we overcome this through the mitzvahs, because when we talk about the mitzvahs and good deeds and things like that, those mitzvahs, those commandments that God gave to us, are an expressed expression of his will and wisdom, and they're not constricted in the same way as other things. And actually, we learned about in this chapter so far that the origin of all the worlds and the life force of all the worlds actually comes from these mitzvahs. So it's actually the source of all of these mitzvahs. So which means that when a person actually does the mitzvahs, this is a way to actually tap into this level of total self-abnegation and allow God to dwell within them. And now the Alter Rebbe here interjects with a bracket, kind of footnote, like a note here, where he says that he heard from his teacher, who was the Maggid of Mezrich, for the reasoning why it is written in the Eitz Chaim that the light of the Ein Sof is not become unified even in the world of Atzilus, which is the highest of all the four worlds, as we've mentioned previously, without being first included in the sphera, in the attribute of Chokhmah. The Ein Sof, meaning literally translating as the infinite, an allusion to God, which is ultimately the ultimate level of God, the highest level of God when we talk about God, is that the true reality of God is that he alone exists and there's nothing aside from him. And this level of where there's nothing aside from him is the level of chokhmah, the level of wisdom. So the Alter Rebbe doesn't really elaborate on this here. He does get into it elsewhere, but kind of what I think we did talk about it previously slightly is that the attribute of chokhmah is a very interesting one because it is sort of like the first of the revealed spheres, the revealed attributes, and it's a combination of two words, koach and ma, which means the power of what. So it kind of has this ability within it to serve as this transfusion of godliness into the world by virtue of the fact that it's somewhat transparent in a certain sense. A very colloquial translation of the word chokhmah often is as intuition, and the way that you can kind of think about it is when people get this they feel like they receive this revelation or inspiration from on high, it almost comes from something outside of themselves. So it's, again, there's a selflessness that's apparent in the attribute of chokhmah, which is what the Alter Rebbe is hinting at here. But he doesn't really elaborate on it too much here, so I won't either, but he will get into it more later on, I'm pretty sure. So let's get back to the text. So the Alter Rebbe now goes on to describe what happens to a person and to a person's soul when they are learning Torah. So when a person's involved learning Torah, then this is primarily an occupation of the godly soul, right? It's a holy kind of thing to do. And the godly soul has three garments to it. Like we mentioned, the animal soul has three garments and the godly soul has three garments. Thought, speech, and action are the three garments. And the two inner garments are thought and speech, whereas the external garment is action. So when a person is involved in Torah study, there are two inner garments, which is speech and thought, are involved in this, right? You're learning Torah and you're thinking about what you're learning, and you're also most probably speaking the words out loud. I mean, that's the way that we're told that we're supposed to learn Torah, is we actually are supposed to mouth the words out loud. So the speech is involved. So that's what happens when we learn Torah. And so at that time, when a person's learning Torah, then indeed these two inner powers of their soul, these two inner garments of their soul, the thought and the speech, actually become subsumed in the light of God and become one with it and unified with it with total unity, which is this dwelling of the Shechina that we've been talking about. So the Shechina does dwell upon a person and upon their godly soul while they are learning Torah, which is why it's taught, and this is taken from the Gemara in Brachos, page 6a, that even one person who sits and studies Torah, the Shechina is with them. So think about that. The next time you are learning Torah by yourself, maybe that's right now while you're learning this Torah, the Shechina is actually resting within you because you're involving your thought and maybe you're also involving your speech. So these two garments of your godly soul are actually totally becoming unified with the Shechina. It's a pretty cool thing. However, this is not the full story, because if you remember, you don't only have a godly soul, you also have an animal soul, and you also have a body. So what about them? Do we just like leave them to dry and forget about them? So the Alter Rebbe addresses this right now, and he says that in order to bring the light of the Shechina into one's body and into their animal soul, which is this vivifying soul that is enclosed within the body, a person actually has to do physical mitzvahs that are done by the body. Because then the power of the body itself becomes subsumed in this light of God and in this will of God, and becomes unified with it with total unity. And this is also the third lavush, the third garment of the godly soul. So remember, we talked about how if a person sits and studies Torah, their inner garments, the first two garments are involved, like the garment of thought and the garment of speech. But the garment of action really only gets activated when a person actually does a physical mitzvah with their physical body. And so then what happens, so when a person actually gets involved in this physical mitzvah, first of all, they're involving this third garment of the godly soul, the garment of action, and then also the power of this vitalizing soul, the otherwise known as the animal soul that's within their body, which actually comes from klipa. Remember we talked about it? It comes from klipas noga. It actually transforms from bad to good and becomes totally subsumed in holiness, just like the godly soul. So we actually are able to, at that moment, when we're doing a mitzvah, to transform the animal soul within us to a godly type of being, where it's so totally unified with God, just like the godly soul is. Because it's actually the animal soul that's doing this mitzvah, because again, we talked about how the animal soul is the vivifying force within the body. So in order to, this is where, the smuggler analogy comes in a little bit, because the godly soul, we'll see, cannot really affect the body directly. It's too spiritual of a being. But the animal soul is this vitalizing force within the body. So the animal soul is what animates the body to do the different mitzvahs. And because the animal soul is the vitalizing force behind the physical action of the mitzvahs, this causes the animal soul to actually become so totally unified with holiness. And this is exactly what the Alter Rebbe says right here, is he says that it's really the animal soul that is the activating force of doing the mitzvah. And without this animal soul, the godly soul would not be able to affect the body at all, because it's totally spiritual and the body is totally physical. And so the intermediary between these two things is this animal soul, which is enclosed within the blood of man, that is in their heart. Remember, and we talked specifically about how it's in the left ventricle of the heart and in the entire body. And even though the actual being and essence of the animal soul, which is in his heart, comes from these negative character traits that we talked about, like it's very selfish by nature and self-centered and self-oriented, nevertheless, this is able to, in this way, through doing the mitzvahs, is able to totally become subsumed in holiness, because we're basically like schlepping it along. Like it's like becoming subjugated to holiness. So all of these evil traits that are found within the animal soul that usually have this desire to do things that are just like really selfish and self-serving, when a person does a mitzvah, their entire animal soul, together with all of these negative traits, are being schlepped along with it. And against their will, they say amen after a bracha, and they actually agree to do a mitzvah from these things, to go along and do a mitzvah. And how is this possible? Like, how are we able to schlepp along our animal soul and our animal instincts to do this? Is because we talked about how, remember how the animal soul is seated in the heart and in the emotions. The godly soul is rooted in and seated in the brain. And innately, the brain actually rules over the heart. So we can control our heart. So ultimately, the godly soul actually does have this slight advantage in that sense, that the brain has this ability to rule over the heart. And these animal instincts at this time are actually in a way of exile and are sleeping. So it's sort of like, again, if we wanted to think about the smuggler, it's sort of like the smuggler is going across the border, and it's as if he hypnotized the guards or gave them a lot of alcohol for them to get drunk or something like that. Like we've sort of put the animal instincts to sleep and allowed the godly soul to rule in that time when we're doing a mitzvah. And thus, these animal instincts that we have, this animal soul does not hold back. It does not prevent the resting of the Shechina to rest upon the body of a person at this time, because the power of the animal soul that is vested within the doing of this particular mitzvah, whatever mitzvah we're talking about, becomes totally subsumed in the light of God and totally unified with it with utmost unity. So what do we mean by this? Just to explain it a little bit is, remember, we talked about how another way to think of the animal soul is to think about it as the vitalizing, animating force within the body. So again, without the animal soul, the godly soul would be not able to do anything really, because it's just totally spiritual and it's not able to connect with the physical body. The animal soul is the one that vitalizes the body and causes the body to move and do things and act in the world. And so when we actually do a particular physical mitzvah, so like let's say you're lighting Shabbos candles, you're putting on tefillin, whatever it is, at that moment, there's a flow of blood in your body and there's an animating force that's causing you to pick up the tefillin, wrap it around your arm, whatever it is, or lift up the matches to light the Shabbos candles, whatever it is. So at that moment, the power in your hands or whatever part of your body is being utilized in the performance of this mitzvah. So the power that's infused in your hand or whatever part it is actually becoming totally connected to God completely. And not only that, but the Alter Rebbe continues and he explains how through the performance of these mitzvahs, not only does just this particular life force, whether it's in the hand or the feet going to perform mitzvah or whatever it is, become totally unified with God. Through the performance of this mitzvah, he actually draws down a radiance to the entirety of his animal soul that is found within the entire body and also to the body itself in a way of Makif. So what is Makif? Makif means an encompassing light. We'll explain this soon. From above the head until the feet. And then the Alter Rebbe quotes something which I believe is from the Zohar, where it says Shechina Shalia al Roshe, which means that the Shechina rests upon their head. So this is an allusion to why men need to wear yarmulkes, like we talked about before. And so what does this mean? The Shechina rests upon their head, so above their head. So it's specifically above, but not inside. And so too, the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that this is the same idea that when there's 10 people that are assembled together, then the Shechina dwells upon this congregation of 10 people. So it's, again, this kind of like hovering above kind of thing, not in a more internal way. And final part of the section, so to explain what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is he says that when a person performs a physical mitzvah, a few things happen. First of all, their godly soul, which has 3 garments. They have the garment of thought, speech, and action. The garment of action in the godly soul is now able to connect with God in a way that it wasn't able to previously, where it's able to totally unified with him. Not only does the action garment of the godly soul unite in this way, the aspects, the power within the animal soul that is the vitalizing force within the animal soul that's allowing the person to do the mitzvah also becomes totally unified and one with God. And not only do these 2 aspects become totally unified with God, but then we also have the entirety of the animal soul as well as the physical body of the person, which, while they don't become unified with God in this total internal way, it doing the mitzvah does cause the Shechina to rest above them, so to speak. So to kind of like hover all around them. So they do get this like radiance of the Shechina all around their body and all around the entirety of their animal soul. So, and now the Alter Rebbe ends this section where he says that this radiance of the Shechina, which is in a way of revelation of the Or Ein Sof, of the infinite light, is not called a difference, God forbid. So it's like, meaning to say that like we're talking about all these different ways that the radiance of God radiates within a person. So it's like there's the internal aspects of the godly soul, the external aspect of the godly soul, the part of the animal soul, which connects with the mitzvah. Like there's all these different ways that the Shechina radiates within a person in these different aspects. And so now the Alter Rebbe is saying here, you should not, God forbid, think that this is indicating that there's a difference within God's light itself. Like just because it may shine and radiate in a different way, there's no actual change or difference within him. And it's not, there's nothing about it that is like, it's not plurality. God is not plurality. His light is not plurality. So it's not like he radiates in this way and that way. And it's like, there's all different types of facets of godly light. No, And the Alter Rebbe here cites the Gemara in Sanhedrin, page 39a, where a certain heretic approached Rabban Gamliel, and he said to him, he kind of like challenged him, and he said that you teach this idea that the Shechina rests on every assembly of 10 men, right? That we talked about that. And so if this is the case, how many Shechinas are there? Like there's the Shechina resting on this congregation, that congregation, each one of the congregations, and on this person and that person. Like it sounds like there's like a million different Shechinas, right? So then Rabban Gamliel replied, and he explained to him that it's just like the analogy of sunlight. So just like you can have like this, if you ever look at like stained glass window, for example, or even not stained glass window, just like a house with lots of different windows, it looks like there's like all these different rays of sunlight that are coming through. And yes, well, there's many different rays of sunlight coming through. It's all coming from one same sun. It's not like it's different suns shining in through each window. So that's the way that we can kind of think of this Shechina, is that it operates in the same way, that it's really just one thing, but it manifests in all these different situations in different ways. So that is the end of this section. And so just to recap and bring it all together and to try to bring it back to this analogy of the smuggler that we talked about before, is that again, so we're talking about, so basically like our goal is what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring godliness down into the world. We're trying to have the Shechina rest upon us. And so how do we do that? So we've talked about this idea that we have the godly soul, we have the animal soul, and we've thought of the godly soul as being more holy, the animal soul as being more selfish and hedonistic and not very holy. And today we kind of learned this new idea that, well, yes, it's true that the godly soul is very holy and is totally a part of God. It has some limitations. Limitation number one is the sense that if you take a tzaddik, who is somebody who is totally connected with their godly soul and their whole entire being and essence is like a manifestation of their godly soul, the way that's represented is through their really high level of love and fear of God. And even if somebody has a very profound love and fear of God on such a deep level that this is how they live their life, the very fact of the matter that there is a person who is loving and fearing God demonstrates the limitation of this, because it shows that there is a person who loves. And we know that God ultimately in the truest form is one, is exclusive. He is the only true reality. So the second you have a lover of God, that's like, it's not the true truth of God. So the true truth of God is actually manifest in his mitzvahs, in his commandment, because the mitzvahs of God are a manifestation of his will and wisdom, which are truly unified with him. So it's not enough, basically, on a practical level, to just sit and think about God and develop a very high level of love and fear of him. While those things are great, we actually do need to do physical mitzvahs, which is why even tzaddikim, even the most righteous people, need to do physical mitzvahs, because through doing physical mitzvahs, they are able to connect with this more completely unified and all-consuming connection with him. And then we also learned about the fact that another limitation of the godly soul is that it is not physical and it has zero connection with physicality. So we talked about how if a person is sitting and learning Torah, well, they may be connecting with their inner garments of the godly soul, and they may be connecting those to God, namely the garments of thought and speech. The garment of action is not being manifest at that time, and it actually can't be manifest on its own, because the godly soul, again, is just entirely spiritual. So this is where we need the animal soul, and this is where the analogy of the smuggler comes in. Because what is the animal soul? The animal soul is the animating force within the body that allows us to move and go through our lives and have the body not just be this corpse. And so through utilizing the animal soul to actually do acts of goodness in the world and do God's will. So we're basically smuggling godliness into the world, and we're bringing godliness down here into this physical body, manifest in our physical bodies. And this accomplishes a few things. First of all, now we're able to access this garment of action within the godly soul, and the garment of action of the godly soul is now able to connect with God in this all-consuming way. So too, the part of the animal soul that's directly involved in performing the mitzvah also connects to God in this total unified way where it becomes totally nullified within him. And not only that, but in fact, the entirety of the animal soul and the body, in fact, kind of get swept along for the ride. And so they too, well, they may not come to this level of connection where they become totally nullified to God in the same way, the radiance that when we perform physical mitzvahs, this causes a radiance to hover above them, hover about all around the entirety of both the animal soul and the entirety of the body. So it has this really profound effect. So I hope that was enlightening to you. I hope I broke it down as best as I could. I know it was, again, a longer episode today, and that's it. And tomorrow we're going to move on to chapter 36. Again, a very deep and intense chapter, one of the more famous chapters in Tanya, the subject of which is actually the purpose of the world. So big topic. So stay tuned and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shechina. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.